October 11th, 1492. Somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, 3 wooden ships creak and groan in the darkness. The Santa Maria, the Pinta, the Nina, each one barely longer than a tennis court, filled with 90 men who are equal parts terrified and exhausted. The smell is overwhelming. 33 days of unwashed bodies, rotting food stores, bilge water sloshing in the holds, salt spray coats, everything. The wood, the ropes, the men's faces. Some are praying, others are plotting mutiny. Most are just staring into the blackness, wondering if they're sailing toward the edge of the world. Christopher Columbus stands on the deck of the Santa Maria watching for signs. Any signs. Birds, floating debris, changes in the water. Anything that might indicate land is near. His crew has been threatening to turn back for days. The promised riches of Asia feel like a fever dream now. He's already lied about how far they've travelled, keeping 2 sets of logs, one real, one fake, because the truth would have caused a mutiny weeks ago. Nobody on these ships knows what's about to happen. Not Columbus, not his crew, not the captains of the other vessels. They think they're on their way to Japan, maybe China. They're not. In a few hours, a lookout named Rodrigo de Triana will spot a white cliff shining in the moonlight, and everything, absolutely everything, will change. Here's the thing, though. What we've been taught about October 12th, 1492 is mostly mythology. The brave explorer discovering a new world, the beginning of progress and civilization. It's a story that's been polished and simplified until it barely resembles what actually happened. The real story is stranger, darker, and infinitely more complex than the version in your history textbooks. What if I told you that Columbus died thinking he'd reached Asia, that he never understood what he'd actually stumbled upon? What if the discovery wasn't a discovery at all, but a collision of 2 worlds, each one utterly incomprehensible to the other? What if the most important consequences of this moment weren't the things anyone intended, but invisible biological forces that would kill more people than every war in human history combined? If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly what this is for. So maybe subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always check, and it's wild seeing Singapore at sunrise, Seattle at midnight, Sao Paulo at dawn, all listening to the same story. Tonight, we're going back to 1492, but not the version you learned in school. We're going to experience what really happened when those ships made landfall. The smell of it, the confusion, the immediate misunderstandings that would echo through centuries. We're going to meet the Taíno people, who had built a complex civilization across the Caribbean and who had absolutely no concept that their entire world was about to end. We're going to follow Columbus through his increasingly delusional Caribbean wanderings, watch him establish the first colony that would mysteriously vanish, see him return to Spain as a hero, while setting in motion one of history's greatest tragedies. But more than that, we're going to explore the invisible revolution, the Columbian Exchange, how horses, wheat, and cattle crossed west while potatoes, tomatoes, and syphilis crossed east, how smallpox and measles, diseases the Taíno had never encountered, would accomplish what armies couldn't, how this single moment would reshape the biology of the entire planet. The night of October 11th, 1492, was the last night the world was separate. 2 hemispheres that had evolved independently for over 10,000 years, each with their own crops, animals, diseases, and destinies. In a few hours they would collide, and nothing, not in Europe, not in the Americas, not anywhere, would ever be the same. So settle in, get comfortable. We're about to sail into the most consequential dawn in human history. Not because Columbus was a hero or a villain, though we'll explore both sides, but because this moment, this collision, set in motion forces that are still shaping your life today. Every time you eat a tomato, ride in a car, catch the flu, speak English in the Americas, or watch the sun set over a world that's been completely remade, you're living in the aftermath of October 12th, 1492. But first, we need to understand the world Columbus left behind, because you can't grasp what happened in the Caribbean without knowing what Europe was in 1492. And it wasn't what you think. Before we follow Columbus across the Atlantic, we need to understand the world he was trying to escape. Because 1492 wasn't just any year. It was a hinge point in European history, a moment when everything old was dying and everything new hadn't quite been born yet. Picture Europe in the late 15th century, not the Europe of romantic paintings or Renaissance fairs, but the real thing, the lived experience. Start with the smell. Most cities reeked of human waste, animal manure and industrial pollution from tanneries and dye works. The Black Death had killed somewhere between 1/3 and half of Europe's population just 140 years earlier. Some regions still hadn't recovered. Walk through parts of the countryside and you'd find abandoned villages, fields gone back to forest, churches with no congregations. The plague had changed everything. It had shattered the medieval economic system, killed the labour surplus that had kept peasants cheap and lords wealthy. Survivors found themselves with options their grandparents never had. Labour was scarce, wages were rising, and the old feudal order was crumbling. This created opportunity for some, terror for others. The established powers, the nobility and the church, could feel their authority slipping. They responded the way threatened powers always respond, with violence, with repression, with desperate attempts to reassert control through force. Spain in 1492 was the epicenter of this reactionary fervour. On January 2nd of that year, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella completed the Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign to drive Muslim rulers out of the Iberian Peninsula. The last Muslim kingdom, Granada, fell after a 10-year siege. For the Spanish monarchs this was both a triumph and a problem. They had just unified their kingdom through holy war. What do you do with a society organised around religious conflict when the conflict suddenly ends? You find a new crusade. Within months, Ferdinand and Isabella issued the Alhambra decree, expelling all Jews who refused to convert to Christianity. Around 200,000 people were forced to flee, abandoning property, businesses, and lives their families had built over centuries. This wasn't just cruelty for its own sake, it was calculated. The monarchs were trying to create religious uniformity, to forge a Spanish identity through exclusion. They were also seizing Jewish assets to refill treasuries depleted by decades of warfare. But there was another problem. Spain had just spent enormous resources conquering Granada. The royal coffers were nearly empty, and everywhere Ferdinand and Isabella looked, other European powers were getting wealthy through trade while Spain remained relatively isolated and poor. The source of that wealth was spices, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg. These weren't luxuries in the modern sense. They were essentials for preserving food, making medicine, and demonstrating status. A merchant who controlled spice trade routes could become richer than kings, and for centuries those routes had been dominated by Italian city-states, particularly Venice and Genoa, working in partnership with Muslim and Asian middlemen. Spices came from the East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, travelled through complex networks of traders across the Indian Ocean, up through the Middle East, and finally to European markets. Each middleman took a cut. By the time pepper reached a European table, it might cost 30 or 40 times what it sold for in its place of origin. European monarchs were obsessed with finding a way around this system. If you could establish a direct route to Asia, bypassing the middlemen, you could flood European markets with cheap spices and become fantastically wealthy. Portugal had been working on this for decades, sending expeditions down the coast of Africa, slowly mapping a route around the continent toward India. Enter Christopher Columbus. Born Cristoforo Colombo in Genoa around 1451, he was the son of a wool weaver. Not nobility, not even wealthy merchants, just skilled tradesmen trying to make a living in a competitive city. Nothing about his background suggested he would change the world. He went to sea young, probably in his early 20s, working on merchant vessels in the Mediterranean. He learned practical navigation, how to read winds and currents, how to manage crews. He also learned something more dangerous. He learned to dream big. Somewhere along the way, Columbus became obsessed with an idea. Instead of sailing east to reach Asia, what if you sailed west? The earth was round, everyone educated knew that. Ancient Greek mathematicians had proven it. The question wasn't whether you could reach Asia by sailing west, but how far you'd have to go. And here's where Columbus made his crucial error, or his crucial lie, depending on how you interpret the evidence. He convinced himself, or claimed to have convinced himself, that Asia was much closer than it actually was. He studied the work of ancient geographers, particularly Ptolemy, but he cherry-picked the estimates that supported his theory. He used the smallest proposed circumference of the Earth and the largest proposed extent of Asia. This made the western route seem feasible. In reality, Asia was about 12,000 miles away sailing west from Europe. Columbus calculated it at around 3,000 miles. He was off by a factor of 4. Did he actually believe this? Or was he knowingly lying to potential investors? We'll never know for certain. What we do know is that he became a man possessed by this idea. Around 1484, Columbus approached King John II of Portugal with his proposal. Portugal was the obvious choice. They had the most advanced navigation knowledge in Europe, the best maps, the most experience with long-range ocean voyages. King John assembled a committee of experts to evaluate Columbus's plan. They tore it apart. The distances were wrong, they said. Asia was too far. Any expedition attempting the western route would run out of supplies long before reaching land. The experts were right, of course. If the Americas hadn't existed, Columbus and his crew would have died at sea. King John rejected the proposal. Columbus tried England next, sending his brother Bartholomew to petition King Henry VII. Another rejection, he approached France. Nothing. For nearly a decade, Columbus travelled Europe trying to convince someone, anyone, to fund his impossible voyage. Most potential sponsors thought he was either deluded or lying. But Columbus had one thing going for him: desperation, not just his own, but Europe's. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 had disrupted traditional trade routes even further. The Portuguese route around Africa was taking decades to develop and was far from certain. There was a tiny chance, a lottery ticket chance, that Columbus might be right, or that he might discover something unexpected along the way. Ferdinand and Isabella initially rejected him too. This was around 1486, and they were focused entirely on the war for Granada. But Columbus was persistent. He hung around the Spanish court for years, living on small stipends, periodically repitching his plan. He befriended influential courtiers, particularly Luis de Santangel, the royal treasurer, and Juan Perez, a friar who had connections to Queen Isabella. These men became his advocates, his lobbyists at court. The key thing to understand is that Isabella and Ferdinand weren't passionate believers in Columbus's vision. They were calculating gamblers weighing minimal risk against potentially massive reward. The actual investment required was relatively small: 3 ships, provisions for a few months, crews that could be recruited from sailors facing unemployment. The contract Columbus demanded was outrageous. 10% of all wealth from any lands discovered, hereditary titles, governorship of new territories. But these costs only kicked in if he succeeded. If he failed, if he simply vanished at sea like so many explorers before him, the crown would be out maybe 2 million maravedis, roughly the cost of hosting a modest royal banquet. Against this small risk, consider the potential reward. If Columbus somehow reached Asia, Spain would control a direct western route to the Spice Islands. They would break the monopoly of Venice and Genoa. They would become the wealthiest kingdom in Europe overnight. Even if Columbus didn't reach Asia but found something else, new lands, new resources, it might still prove profitable. The logic was sound if you were a monarch with money to spare and ambitions to feed. But Ferdinand and Isabella didn't have money to spare. Not in 1492. Their treasury was depleted from the Granada campaign. So where did the funding actually come from? Here's where the story gets interesting. Most of the money came from a syndicate of Italian merchant bankers working in Spain, with Luis de Santangel as the primary organizer. These were businessmen looking for investment opportunities, not romantic adventurers. They fronted about 1.4 million maravedis. Columbus himself, or rather his sponsors in Genoa, contributed another 500,000. The Spanish crown's direct contribution was minimal, mostly in the form of royal authorization and some salary payments to crew members. This wasn't a national expedition in the modern sense. It was closer to a public-private partnership, a venture capital deal with royal backing. The crown provided legitimacy and legal authority. Private investors provided cash. Columbus provided expertise and took personal risk. Everyone was gambling that long odds might pay off. On April 17th, 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella signed the capitulations of Santa Fe, the contract granting Columbus his titles and percentages in exchange for his service. On August 3rd, just 7 months after the fall of Granada and 4 months after the expulsion of the Jews was ordered, 3 small ships sailed from the port of Palos. Columbus was 41 years old. He had spent nearly a decade begging for this opportunity. He was deeply in debt, personally and financially committed to an idea that most educated people thought was nonsense. He was carrying letters of introduction to the Great Khan of China, a ruler whose dynasty had actually ended 120 years earlier. He had maps showing Japan about where the Caribbean actually is. And he was sailing into an ocean that Europeans had barely explored, heading toward a continent they didn't know existed, carrying technologies and diseases that would reshape human history, none of which he intended or understood. But before we follow him across that ocean, take one more look at the Europe he was leaving behind, a continent scarred by plague and war, societies organized around religious exclusion and rigid hierarchies, economies desperate for new sources of wealth, technologies just advanced enough to cross an ocean, but not advanced enough to understand what they would find. Columbus wasn't a hero setting out to discover a new world. He was a stubborn, possibly delusional entrepreneur who had finally convinced risk-tolerant investors to fund his questionable business plan. He was a man of his time, shaped by its assumptions and blind spots, pursuing goals that made sense in 1492, but would look horrifying through any modern lens. The 3 ships that left Palos carried about 90 men total. Within a generation, the civilizations those men encountered would be devastated. Within a century, the world's population centers would shift, its ecosystems would be transformed, and the modern global system would begin taking shape. But none of that was intentional. None of it was planned. It just happened because Columbus was wrong about geography, right about seamanship, and lucky enough to run into a continent he wasn't looking for. Now let's follow those ships west into the unknown. August 3rd, 1492. 3 ships slip out of Palos de la Frontera in the pre-dawn darkness. Not because Columbus wanted drama, but because he needed to catch the morning tide. The Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. You've probably heard they were tiny, barely seaworthy vessels that made the crossing miraculous. That's not quite right. The Santa Maria was about 58 feet long. That's roughly the length of a modern bowling lane. The Nina and Pinta were smaller, maybe 50 feet. But here's what matters. These weren't little pleasure boats. They were working cargo vessels designed to handle the rough Atlantic crossing to West Africa and back. The Santa Maria was a nau, a cargo carrier built to haul wine barrels and grain. The Nina and Pinta were caravels, faster, more manoeuvrable, better suited to exploration. Columbus didn't pick them because they were small. He picked them because they were proven Atlantic vessels, because their owners were willing to make the trip, and because the Spanish crown was funding this expedition on a budget that would make a modern accountant weep. But the real story isn't the ships, it's the 90 men aboard them. This is where the myths really break down. You might imagine Columbus sailed with a crew of criminals, convicts released from prison cells to man his desperate voyage into the unknown. That's partially true, but it misses the bigger picture. Yes, there were 4 men who'd been granted royal pardons in exchange for joining the expedition. 4 out of 90. The rest, professional sailors, most of them from the Palos region, recruited through a combination of royal decree and good old-fashioned peer pressure. The Pinzon brothers, Martin Alonso and Vicente Yanez, were respected local ship captains who brought their own crews. Their involvement wasn't charity. They saw opportunity, potential profit from whatever trade routes or territories Columbus might discover. Then you had the specialists, a physician, a translator who spoke Arabic, because Columbus expected to reach Asia, a comptroller to record any gold or valuables they found, several minor nobility looking for advancement, the servant of Columbus himself. These weren't desperate men with nothing to lose. These were professionals on a calculated risk. But what they didn't have was certainty. Nobody knew exactly how far they'd have to sail. Columbus told them maybe 2,400 miles to reach Japan. He was lowballing. The actual distance to Asia going west is over 12,000 miles. There's a whole continent in the way, and an ocean beyond that. But Columbus either didn't know or didn't care. He'd convinced himself that the world was smaller than the ancient geographers claimed, that Asia extended farther east than anyone thought, that the journey was possible with medieval technology and 16th century supplies. So they sailed. First to the Canary Islands, where they stopped for repairs. The Pinta's rudder needed fixing. They took on water, fresh provisions, the last European food most of them would eat for months. Then on September 6th, they pushed off into the true unknown, the ocean sea, what we call the Atlantic. This is where the psychological journey begins. The first week spirits are high. Good winds, clear skies, the ships making steady progress. Columbus keeps 2 logs. The public log read to the crew shows conservative distances. The private log, his real calculations, shows the true mileage. Why the deception? He's managing fear. If the crew knows exactly how far they're sailing from any known land, they might panic, might demand to turn back before the point of no return. By the second week, the novelty is wearing off. They're in open ocean, no land visible in any direction, just endless blue water and sky. The ships are small enough that every man can feel the Atlantic swells, the constant motion that never stops. Not even when you're trying to sleep on a wooden deck or in a cramped below-deck space that smells like bilge water, sweat, and salt. They see things. Floating seaweed that seems to go on forever. This is the Sargasso Sea, a vast region of the Atlantic where currents create an enormous gyre of floating vegetation. To sailors in 1492 it looks wrong, unnatural. Like the ocean is turning into land, like they're about to run aground thousands of miles from shore. The seaweed wraps around the rudders, slows their progress, creates a sense that the ocean itself is trying to stop them. Some of the men become convinced they'll never make it home. The winds that have been pushing them west, perfect sailing winds that Columbus takes as divine favour, those same winds mean they'll never be able to sail back east. They'll reach Asia, if they reach anything at all, and they'll be stranded there forever, too far to return. Columbus tries to reassure them. The winds will change, he says. They always do. Trust him. Trust God. Keep sailing. By late September, there are whispers of mutiny, not organised rebellion, just the low murmur of men who are starting to calculate their odds. They've been sailing for 3 weeks. The distances Columbus recorded in the public log, the ones the crew believes, add up to roughly the distance he'd promised to Japan. So where is it? Where's the land? The trade winds are still pushing them west, but provisions are starting to matter. Water is rationed. The food is ship's biscuit and salt meat, monotonous and barely adequate. If they don't find land soon, they'll have to turn back while they still have supplies for the return journey, assuming they can sail back, assuming the winds cooperate, assuming Columbus hasn't led them all to their deaths. October begins with false hopes. Birds appear, more and more species flying overhead. Birds mean land, everyone knows that. But how far? Birds can fly for days. These could be coming from islands hundreds of miles away, or they could mean landfall is imminent. Columbus starts watching for signs with desperate intensity. Floating branches with green leaves, a piece of carved wood, clearly worked by human tools, a small board, a stick covered with barnacles. The crew's mood swings wildly between hope and despair. Every sunset without land brings fresh complaints. Every sunrise with new bird sightings brings renewed energy. Columbus promises rewards. The Spanish monarchs have offered 10,000 maravedis, a silk doublet, and a lifetime pension to whoever spots land first. The men start seeing things, phantom coastlines that dissolve as they approach, cloud formations that look like mountains. The human eye, desperate for patterns, finds them everywhere. On October 10th, the situation reaches its breaking point. It's been 33 days since they left the Canaries, over a month of nothing but ocean. Martin Alonso Pinzon, captain of the Pinta, suggests they continue just 3 more days. If they don't find land by then, they turn back. Columbus agrees, though his private writings suggest he would have kept going regardless. He's too invested now, too certain of his calculations, or too stubborn to admit error. October 11th, the final day of the deadline. The signs are everywhere now. More birds than they've seen since leaving Europe. Fresh vegetation floating past. A small branch with red berries still attached. The water changes colour, becomes lighter, suggesting shallow seas ahead. Islands, has to be islands. That night Columbus thinks he sees a light, a flicker on the horizon, like a candle being raised and lowered. He calls witnesses, but by the time they arrive, it's gone. Was it real? Was it wishful thinking? Was it some strange atmospheric phenomenon? Nobody knows, but it doesn't matter. Because at 2 a.m. on October 12th, Rodrigo de Triana, a lookout on the Pinta, sees something unmistakable. White cliffs gleaming in the moonlight. Land. After 33 days of sailing into nothing, after weeks of doubt and fear and near mutiny, after a month of trusting Columbus's calculations against every sailor's instinct, they've found land. The ships heave too, dropping anchor in the darkness. They're not going to risk a night approach to an unknown shore, so they wait. The crew, the men who've been questioning everything for weeks, they wait in darkness just off the coast of what they think is Asia. They don't know they've discovered a continent that will change everything. They don't know they're anchored off an island whose inhabitants have been living there for centuries. They don't know that come morning, 2 worlds that have existed in complete isolation for over 10,000 years are about to collide. They just know they found land. They survived. And whatever comes next, at least they're not going to die at sea. At 2 a.m. on October 12th, 1492, a sailor named Rodrigo de Triana was probably fighting sleep at his post on the Pinta. He'd been staring at darkness for 33 days, watching endless ocean, seeing nothing but waves and more waves. Then something changed. A shadow against the stars. A darkness darker than the water. He'd seen false landfalls before, clouds on the horizon that looked like mountains, tricks of moonlight on waves. But this was different. This was solid, real, land. He screamed, "Tierra! Tierra! Land! Land!" The cry echoed across the water between the ships. Within minutes, every sailor in the fleet was awake, straining their eyes toward the western horizon. Columbus appeared on deck, squinting into the darkness. He could see it too, a low dark mass interrupting the starlight. After 33 days, after years of planning, after a lifetime of obsession, he had found land. But here's where the story gets complicated. Columbus had promised a reward, 10,000 maravedis a year for life, to whoever spotted land first. That reward should have gone to Rodrigo de Triana. He saw it first. He called it out. Everyone aboard witnessed it. But Columbus claimed that actually he had seen a light, a faint flickering on the horizon hours earlier around 10 p.m. A light that no one else had apparently noticed. A light that he hadn't bothered mentioning at the time. A light that was almost certainly invented after the fact because Columbus wanted that reward for himself. He got it. The sailor who actually spotted land got nothing. This wasn't just petty theft. It was the first of many acts of casual cruelty that would define Columbus's time in the Americas. The pattern was established before his feet even touched shore. Take credit, take rewards, take whatever you want because you have the power to do it. But for now, in those dark hours before dawn, none of that mattered. The fleet hove to, waiting for daylight. No one was crazy enough to attempt a landing on an unknown shore in complete darkness. So they waited, bobbing on the swells, watching the dark mass slowly take shape as the eastern sky began to lighten. Columbus must have been unable to sleep. He had imagined this moment for years. In his mind, he was about to set foot in Asia, maybe Japan, maybe China. Definitely somewhere fabulously wealthy, where the people wore silk and traded in spices and gold. He was about to become the most famous man in Europe. History was about to remember his name forever. He was right about that last part, at least. As dawn broke, the island revealed itself. White beaches glowing in the early light, palm trees swaying in the breeze, green forest rising inland, clear turquoise water so transparent you could see fish swimming in schools beneath the surface. It looked, Columbus would later write, like paradise, beautiful, lush, welcoming. Nothing like the storm-racked Atlantic they'd been crossing for over a month. Nothing like the crowded, dirty, plague-ridden cities of Europe. This was something new, something that didn't fit any category they had words for, but they weren't alone. From the forest, hundreds of eyes watched them. The Taíno people of the island they called Guanahani had seen the ships approaching the day before. 3 massive vessels, bigger than anything they'd ever seen, with huge white sails that caught the wind like wings. All night they'd debated. What were these things? Who was aboard? Were they gods, spirits, enemies, traders? The ships looked like no watercraft the Taíno had ever encountered. Their own canoes, some capable of carrying 100 people, were carved from single massive trees. But these vessels were assembled from countless pieces, built up rather than carved out. The technology was completely alien, and now, as the sun rose, boats were being lowered from the ships. Men were climbing down into them. Men with pale skin. Men wearing strange, layered clothing despite the tropical heat. Men carrying bright metal objects and colourful banners. The boats began rowing toward shore. Imagine being on that beach. You've lived your entire life on this island. You know every tree, every reef, every current and tide. Your ancestors have been here for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. Your world is stable, comprehensible, ordered, and now these impossible ships have appeared, bringing people who look wrong, dress wrong, smell wrong, probably. Everything about them violates your understanding of how the world works. Some of the Taíno watching probably wanted to run. Others wanted to attack, drive these strangers back into the sea before they could bring trouble. But the leaders, the caciques who made decisions for the community, they held back. These strangers might be dangerous, yes, but they might also be valuable. They might bring new goods, new knowledge, new alliances. Better to wait. Watch. See what they wanted. Columbus stepped into the surf around mid-morning. He was wearing his best clothes, armour polished. The royal standard of Ferdinand and Isabella clutched in his hands. Behind him came his captains, carrying banners with green crosses and the initials of the Spanish monarchs. They were performing a ritual, a very specific legal ceremony that Columbus had been instructed to carry out. They splashed through the warm Caribbean water, climbed onto the beach, and stuck their flags in the sand. Then Columbus began reading, out loud in Spanish, to an audience that couldn't understand a single word. He proclaimed that this island and all its people now belonged to the Spanish crown. By the authority of the Pope and the Spanish monarchs, by right of discovery and Christian dominion, this land was now Spanish territory. The Taíno watching from the trees had just been conquered, and they didn't even know it. The ceremony of possession was a legal fiction, a paperwork exercise that Europeans used to justify their land grabs. The logic went like this. If a Christian nation discovered a land inhabited by non-Christians, they could claim it simply by performing this ritual. Plant a flag, read a proclamation, and suddenly you owned everything in sight. The people already living there? Their opinions didn't matter. Their prior occupation didn't count. In European legal theory, only Christians could truly own land. Everyone else was just using it temporarily until proper Christian owners showed up. It was insane, of course. Imagine if it worked in reverse. Imagine if a Taíno canoe had somehow crossed the Atlantic, landed in Spain, and declared that Seville now belonged to the cacique of Guanahani, because they planted a stick in the ground and said some words in Arawak. The Spanish would have laughed, then probably killed them. But somehow, when Europeans did it in the Americas, they convinced themselves it was legitimate. After the ceremony, things got weird fast. The Taíno cautiously began emerging from the forest. These were people who valued hospitality, who had cultural traditions of welcoming strangers, sharing food, offering gifts. They approached the Spanish slowly, hands probably open to show they weren't carrying weapons. They brought parrots, balls of cotton thread, small carved objects, peace offerings, or maybe just curious attempts to start a trade relationship. Columbus and his men responded by pulling out glass beads, cheap glass beads, the kind you could buy by the barrel in any European port. Red ones mostly, and little hawk bells, tiny brass bells that made a tinkling sound. They offered these trinkets to the Taíno in exchange for whatever the islanders were willing to give, and the Taíno were delighted. Glass was exotic to them, a material they couldn't manufacture. The beads were beautiful, colourful, perfectly shaped. The bells made fascinating sounds. This seemed like a great trade. They gave away cotton, parrots, small golden ornaments in exchange for these wonderful new objects. Both sides thought they were getting a bargain. But Columbus knew better. He knew exactly what he was doing. In his journal that night he wrote that these people would make excellent servants, that they could easily be converted to Christianity and put to work, that they seemed to have no weapons worth mentioning, and could probably be conquered with just 50 men. He noted carefully that some of them wore small gold ornaments and were eager to trade for worthless trifles. Gold. That was what mattered. These people had gold, and they were willing to give it away for glass beads. He also wrote that they seemed generous, gentle, and peaceable, that they shared everything they had without hesitation, that they appeared to live in a kind of innocent paradise, without weapons or warfare or malice. You can almost hear him calculating. These traits that made the Taíno good people, generous people, also made them perfect victims. Their openness was a weakness. Their hospitality was an opportunity. Their lack of iron weapons and their apparent unfamiliarity with organized warfare meant they could be exploited with minimal risk. What Columbus didn't write, but what we can infer from later accounts, is that first contact probably felt profoundly unsettling to both groups. The Spanish must have been disturbed by how different everything was. The Taíno nakedness, their inability to understand any European language, the simple technology they used, all of it challenged European assumptions about civilization. These people didn't fit neatly into any category. They weren't Muslim, weren't Asian, weren't African. They were something entirely outside European experience. And the Taíno must have been equally confused. These pale strangers wore layers and layers of clothing in the tropical heat. They had amazing metal tools that could cut through wood like it was soft clay. They had weapons that made loud noises and could kill from a distance. But they also seemed incompetent in basic ways. They didn't know which plants were edible, couldn't navigate a canoe properly, appeared to have no understanding of the local environment. They were simultaneously impressive and helpless, powerful and vulnerable. Neither group fully understood what was happening. Columbus thought he was in Asia, beginning a trading relationship with subjects of the Great Khan. The Taíno thought they were welcoming strange visitors who would eventually leave, probably after trading for a while. Both were catastrophically wrong. This wasn't a trade relationship beginning. This was a collision between worlds, the first moment of a conquest that would destroy the Taíno people within 2 generations and transform the Americas forever. But on that October morning, with the sun warming the beach and trade goods changing hands, and everyone smiling despite understanding nothing the other side said, it probably felt peaceful, hopeful even. 2 peoples meeting for the first time, curious about each other, eager to see what might come next. The violence and exploitation would come later. For now, there were just parrots and glass beads, and nobody yet understood what they'd started. But before we follow Columbus further into this story, we need to understand what was actually there. Not the fantasy islands he imagined, not the outskirts of Asia he believed he'd found, but the real place, the real people, the civilization that had been building itself over 1,000 years before 3 Spanish ships appeared on the horizon. The Caribbean islands weren't empty. They weren't primitive. They were home to somewhere between 1 and 3 million people, depending on which estimates you trust. The Taíno, as they called themselves, meaning good or noble people. And they had created something remarkable across these scattered islands. Not a single unified empire like the Aztecs or Inca, but something more subtle. A network of chiefdoms connected by kinship, trade, and shared culture that stretched from Cuba to Puerto Rico, from Hispaniola to the smaller islands of the Lesser Antilles. Think about what that meant. These weren't isolated tribes living on individual islands with no contact. The Taíno were master seafarers. They built canoes, some large enough to hold 50 people, carved from single massive tree trunks, saber trees, cotton trees, which they considered sacred, the dwelling places of ancestral spirits. They would hollow these giants using controlled fire and stone tools, a process that could take months. The result was ocean-going vessels capable of travelling hundreds of miles between islands, and they did travel, constantly. Archaeological evidence shows trade goods moving across enormous distances. Special types of stone for making tools, only found on certain islands, showing up hundreds of miles away. Shell ornaments crafted in one location appearing in graves on distant islands. Pottery styles spreading and evolving as groups shared techniques and designs. This wasn't random drift. This was systematic exchange, networks of kinship and obligation that kept the islands connected. When you were born Taíno, you weren't just part of a village. You were part of a lineage that probably had relatives on 6 islands. Marriage alliances connected chiefs across vast stretches of water. If your island got hit by a hurricane and destroyed your crops, you had cousins 3 islands away who would help you survive until the next planting season. It was a meta-population structure, just like those ancient humans during the bottleneck, except the Taíno had done it deliberately. They'd engineered a civilization that could survive Caribbean storms, droughts, and disasters by spreading their people across the water. Their daily life was sophisticated in ways Columbus never recognized. He saw them as simple because they didn't wear much clothing in the tropical heat and didn't have metal tools. But simplicity isn't the same as primitive. The Taíno had developed what anthropologists call intensive horticulture, a system that could feed large populations without the environmental destruction of European-style agriculture. Their main crop was cassava, also called yucca, a starchy root that could grow in poor soil and withstand drought better than most grains. But cassava is naturally toxic. It contains cyanide compounds that will make you sick or kill you if you don't process it correctly. The Taíno had figured out complex preparation techniques. They would grate the root, squeeze out the poisonous juice using woven strainers called sebucans, then dry the remaining flour and bake it into bread. This bread, called casabe, could last for months without spoiling. Perfect for island life where storms could destroy fresh crops without warning. They also grew sweet potatoes, beans, peppers, peanuts, and pineapples. They planted in mounded fields called conucos, which improved drainage and created microclimates that let them grow multiple crops in the same space. They weren't just farming. They were practicing what modern agronomists would call permaculture, creating sustainable food systems that enriched rather than depleted their environment. And they had time for art. So much art. The Taíno created elaborate ceremonial objects carved from stone, shell, and wood. Their zemies, spiritual objects that represented gods and ancestors, were crafted with incredible skill. Some small enough to carry, others massive stone figures that required coordinated effort to create and move. These weren't idle decorations. They were the center of Taíno religious and political life. Because Taíno society was deeply spiritual in ways that Europeans couldn't quite grasp. They believed in a world filled with invisible powers, spirits that inhabited everything from the great saber trees to the smallest stream. The zemis were physical representations of these powers, objects through which the spiritual world could communicate with the living. Chiefs kept the most powerful zemis, consulted them before important decisions, used them in ceremonies that reinforced their authority. Their social structure was complex and hierarchical, but not in the European sense. At the top were the caciques, the chiefs who ruled individual villages or alliances of villages. But cacique authority wasn't absolute. It was earned and maintained through generosity, spiritual power, and successful leadership. A cacique who failed his people could lose his position. The role wasn't just inherited automatically. It required demonstrated ability. And here's something that would have shocked Columbus if he'd understood it. Taíno society had significant roles for women in ways that European society didn't. Women could become caciques. Not often, but it happened. Female chiefs led villages and commanded respect. More commonly, women held important positions as spiritual leaders, as shamans called bohiques, who could communicate with the spirit world and cure diseases. Taíno cosmology was elaborate. They had creation myths that explained the origin of their people and their islands. In one story, humans emerged from caves in the earth, led out into the world by a great ancestor. The sun turned some of these first humans into trees and birds and animals. Those who remained became the Taíno. Another myth told of how the islands themselves were created when a great gourd containing the waters of the world was broken, flooding the land except for the highest mountain peaks, which became the Caribbean islands. They believed in an afterlife, a paradise called Coibe, where the souls of the dead went to feast and dance forever. The dead weren't gone. They remained present, accessible through ritual and through the zemies. Ancestors could advise the living, warn of dangers, provide spiritual power to their descendants. This is why they practiced elaborate burial customs, carefully placing bodies with grave goods that would serve them in the next world. Columbus saw none of this, or rather, he saw it, and couldn't understand it. He noticed that Taíno people wore gold ornaments and assumed they must be near wealthy kingdoms. He saw their generosity in offering gifts and assumed they would be easy to exploit. He observed their spiritual practices and dismissed them as devil worship or simple superstition. Most tragically, he saw their initial friendliness and peaceful reception and mistook it for weakness. The archaeological record tells a different story. Taíno settlements show signs of sophisticated social organization. Large plaza areas for ceremonies and ball games. Yes, they had ball games with rubber balls and formal courts. Specialized structures for chiefs and spiritual leaders. Evidence of craft specialization, with some villages focusing on pottery, others on stone carving, others on creating shell ornaments for trade. This was a civilization with division of labor, with artists and specialists, with enough surplus production to support people who didn't directly produce food. Their population density was higher than Columbus realized. Some estimates suggest Hispaniola alone held over 1 million people. The islands weren't pristine wilderness. They were carefully managed landscapes where humans had lived for centuries, shaping the environment through controlled burning, selective planting, and careful resource management. And they had history, centuries of it. Stories passed down through generations about legendary chiefs. Great storms survived, wars fought and resolved, migrations and alliances and feuds. When Columbus arrived, the Taíno were in the middle of their own complex historical moment, dealing with pressure from Carib raiders from the south, managing political tensions between different caciques, adapting to environmental changes they'd observed over generations. They were living, breathing, complex human beings with full interior lives. They fell in love and grieved losses and worried about their children and took pride in their craftsmanship and argued about politics and told jokes and sang songs. They had individual personalities, ambitions, fears, dreams. They were not a monolith. They were not simple. They were not waiting for someone to discover them. They were there, living their lives, managing their civilization across the water, when 3 strange ships appeared and everything changed forever. Within a few decades, 90% or more of them would be dead. Their languages would be disappearing. Their oral histories would be lost. Their sophisticated understanding of Caribbean ecology, developed over 1,000 years, would be forgotten. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. On that morning of October the 12th, 1492, the Taíno people of Guanahani had no idea what was about to begin. They saw strange ships and strange men and approached with curiosity and the hospitality that their culture demanded. They offered gifts. They showed kindness to strangers who had clearly travelled far. They acted, in other words, like civilized people receiving visitors. And Columbus, standing on that beach, saw everything and understood nothing. Columbus wasn't satisfied with San Salvador. How could he be? This tiny island had friendly people, beautiful beaches, and no gold. Well, almost no gold. The Taíno wore small gold ornaments, little pieces barely worth mentioning, but to Columbus those tiny fragments were like breadcrumbs leading to a treasure vault. He just had to follow them. So he asked in his clumsy combination of gestures and the few words he'd learned where the gold came from. The Taíno pointed south and west. They used a word that sounded like Colba or Cuba. Columbus heard what he wanted to hear. Cuba. That had to be Chipango, Japan, the island Marco Polo had described as having palaces roofed with gold. Never mind that the Taíno were clearly indicating another island. Never mind that nothing about these people or their villages suggested proximity to the sophisticated Asian civilizations he'd read about. Columbus had decided. Cuba was Japan. On October 14th, just 2 days after the initial landing, he was already moving on. He took 6 Taíno men with him, not as guests, as captives, guides, interpreters, proof. The word took does a lot of work in historical accounts. It sounds almost passive, like picking up seashells from a beach. But these were people, men with families, communities, lives they hadn't planned on leaving. Columbus justified it as necessary. How else would he communicate with other islands? How else would he find the gold? The ends justified the means. They always do, until history looks back and asks uncomfortable questions. For the next 2 weeks, Columbus Island hopped through the Bahamas. Every island was beautiful. Every island had friendly people. Every island had no gold, or at least not enough gold. He named them as he went: Santa Maria de la Concepción, Fernandina, Isabella. Names that meant something to him and his crew, nothing to the people who'd lived there for centuries. It's remarkable how quickly he fell into the pattern that would define European colonization for the next 400 years. Arrive, claim, rename, move on. The Taíno guides kept pointing westward. Bigger islands, they seemed to say. More people. Perhaps understanding that Columbus was obsessed with the yellow metal, perhaps hoping he'd leave their home islands alone, they indicated that yes, to the west there was gold. Whether they were telling the truth, telling him what he wanted to hear, or simply trying to send him somewhere anywhere else, we'll never know. On October 28th, Columbus reached Cuba, and here's where his delusions started hardening into something more troubling. Cuba wasn't a small island. As he sailed along its northern coast day after day, the land kept extending to the horizon. This wasn't the modest islands he'd been hopping between. This was big. Big enough to be a continent. Big enough to be Asia. Columbus convinced himself, absolutely convinced himself, that this was the mainland of China. Not an island in a previously unknown archipelago. Not a new world. The mainland of Asia. Exactly where he'd planned to arrive. He sent scouts inland looking for cities, for the Khan's representatives, for evidence of the sophisticated Asian civilization that must surely be just beyond the next valley. They found Taíno villages, tobacco farms, people living in organized communities but nothing remotely resembling Chinese cities. The scouts came back with reports of a large village, maybe 50 houses, where people grew cotton and strange plants they dried and smoked. The locals had been friendly, even awed by the Europeans, but there were no gold temples, no silk-robed officials, no evidence whatsoever that they were anywhere near China. Columbus wrote it all down anyway, describing Cuba as part of the Asian mainland with such conviction you'd think he'd seen Beijing himself. This wasn't just optimism. This was a man who needed reality to conform to his promises. He'd told Ferdinand and Isabella he could reach Asia by sailing west. Therefore, this had to be Asia. The alternative was that he'd made the most expensive navigational error in history. For 6 weeks he explored Cuba's northern coast, sailing into harbours, meeting local populations, always searching for the gold that would justify his voyage. The Taíno of Cuba were similar to those in the Bahamas, generous, curious, organized into larger communities with what seemed to be more sophisticated agriculture. They grew cassava, corn, sweet potatoes. They had extensive trade networks, indicated by the variety of goods and materials found in their settlements. But they didn't have the vast gold deposits Columbus had promised. His journals from this period show a man trying to reconcile two incompatible realities. He described the land as extraordinarily beautiful, the climate as perfect, the harbours as excellent. All true. But then he'd write about how this must be the land Marco Polo described, how the Khan's cities must be just inland, how the gold mines were surely nearby. He was describing two different places simultaneously, the place that existed and the place he needed to exist. By early December, the Taíno guides were indicating another large island to the east. They called it Bohio, which Columbus heard as Haiti or Hispaniola. And there, they gestured, there was gold, real gold, lots of it. Maybe they were tired of the strange bearded men prowling their coasts. Maybe they genuinely knew of gold deposits. Maybe they were just telling the increasingly frustrated admiral what he clearly wanted to hear. Columbus sailed east, and on December 6th, 1492, he reached the island that would become the centre of Spanish colonization in the Americas. Hispaniola was different from the start, larger than Cuba, with more varied terrain, mountains visible from the coast, and the Taíno here did have more gold. Not mountains of it, not palaces roofed with it, but visible amounts. People wearing gold jewellery, gold dust in streams, small mines where they extracted the metal. Columbus's mood transformed. Here, finally, was evidence he could take home, evidence that these islands had resources worth exploiting. He wrote with renewed enthusiasm about the rivers that must surely contain gold, the mountains that certainly hide gold mines, the people who undoubtedly know where much more gold can be found. His certainty had returned, but it was based less on evidence than on necessity. The relationship with the Taíno of Hispaniola started like the others. Friendly exchanges, gifts traded, mutual curiosity. But there was an edge now. Columbus was asking more insistently about gold. His men were ranging farther inland without permission. The guides they'd taken from other islands couldn't go home, and Columbus was writing in his journal about how easy it would be to conquer these people, how a small force could subjugate the entire island. The delusion was complete now. He'd convinced himself he was in Asia, that these islands were outposts of the Great Khan's empire, that vast wealth was just waiting to be claimed. He'd stopped seeing what was actually there, a thriving Caribbean civilization, complex societies adapted to their environment over millennia, people with their own systems, values and ways of life. Instead, he saw resources, opportunities, souls to be converted and labour to be exploited. His men were getting restless too. Months at sea, promises of gold finding only small amounts. Some were sick, all were tired. The adventure was wearing thin, becoming work, becoming something more ominous. They'd crossed the ocean to get rich, and so far the biggest achievement was not dying and planting flags on islands that didn't need their flags. Then, on Christmas Eve, 1492, exhausted from weeks of exploration along Hispaniola's northern coast, Columbus did something uncharacteristic. He went to sleep, leaving a cabin boy at the helm of the Santa Maria, the flagship, the largest vessel in his fleet, left in the hands of an inexperienced boy while the crew slept. Professional sailors didn't do this, but Columbus was tired, stressed, living in the gap between what he'd promised and what he'd found. What happened next would change everything, though nobody knew it yet. The Santa Maria, drifting in calm waters, ran aground on a coral reef. On Christmas morning, 1492, Columbus woke up to disaster, and like everything else on this voyage, he'd find a way to see it as providence. Picture the scene. It's Christmas morning, 1492, but there are no churches here, no bells, no snow, just warm air, thick with the smell of salt and wet timber, and the sound of waves hitting a sandbar they shouldn't have hit. In the darkness of the night before, Columbus's flagship, the Santa Maria, had drifted onto a reef off the coast of what is now northern Haiti. Not in some dramatic storm, just a quiet, almost lazy disaster. A dozing helmsman, a current no one quite understood, a slow grinding sound in the dark wood on coral. By the time the sun rose, the ship that had carried him across the Atlantic was finished. The hull was stuck fast. The timbers were starting to twist. the ship would never sail again. On most voyages in the 15th century, this would have been the end of the story. Shipwreck, panic, desperate repairs, and if those failed, starvation or capture or slow disappearance from history. But Columbus was not ready to let the story end. He looked at the wreck and saw something else. He saw building material. The Taíno on shore helped evacuate the cargo. Gold trinkets, food stores, the ship's cannon, iron tools. They paddled back and forth in canoes as the Spanish crew hauled out beams and planks, cutting and prying them away from the dying ship. What had been a symbol of European power was suddenly just a pile of wood to be repurposed. From that wreckage, Columbus and his men began to build something new, a fort, a foothold, the first European settlement in the Americas. They called it La Navidad, the Nativity, the birth. It wasn't a city, not even a town. Think smaller, a palisade of wooden stakes, a few rough buildings with plank walls and thatched roofs, storage for barrels of food and trade goods, a place to keep gunpowder dry, maybe a crude watchtower, more symbolic than effective. Surrounded not by empty wilderness but by Taíno villages, fields of cassava and well-tended gardens. To the Taíno, who were already used to building large communal houses and organizing village life, the little wooden fort must have seemed more like a guest hut than a capital of anything. But to Columbus this was enormous. A European outpost on the far side of the ocean, proof he could present to his monarchs, a claim hammered into the coastline with Spanish nails and Catholic names. The Santa Maria couldn't sail home, but the Niña could, and the Pinta, after going missing for weeks, had finally rejoined the expedition. Not everyone could fit on the return voyage. Space was limited. Political calculations were not. So Columbus made a decision. He would leave some of his men behind. We know the number 39. Almost always given with that quiet, ominous precision. Not 40, not about 3 dozen. 39 men suddenly becoming something new in history, the first permanent, though not for long, European residents in the Caribbean. Who were they? Not nobles, not admirals, not royal envoys. Most were ordinary sailors, craftsmen, lower-ranking officers. A few were men Columbus didn't mind parting with. Some had caused trouble on the voyage, others were ambitious and eager for opportunity. A handful, perhaps, were genuinely curious, drawn by the idea of staying in this warm green world instead of going back to the cold uncertainties of Spain. Columbus promised them riches, gold to be found inland, land to be claimed, women to be married, crops to be planted, glory to be earned in the service of Castile and Aragon. He may have wrapped it all in pious language, spreading the faith, preparing the way for priests and churches, but the men probably heard something simpler. Stay here, and you could end up lords of your own little world. He also gave them rules. Keep the peace with the Taíno. Obey the leaders he appointed. Don't roam far without permission. Don't mistreat the people who had so far fed them, housed them, and helped them salvage the wreck. Those instructions would not survive the months ahead. To help maintain goodwill, Columbus left gifts for the local cacique, Guacanagari, whose people had helped rescue the Santa Maria's crew. He praised Guacanagari's kindness. He saw an ally, a potential client ruler, someone who could be turned into Spain's man on the island. Then he did what must have felt, even to him, both thrilling and terrifying. He sailed away. The Niña and the Pinta lifted anchor and headed east, carrying Columbus, a handful of Taíno captives, animal skins, strange plants, stories of islands thick with gold, and one huge implied promise. This was just the beginning. You can almost imagine the quiet that followed as the ships shrank into the horizon, the creak of the fort's wooden walls in the heat of the afternoon, the buzz of insects, the distant laughter of Taíno children, 39 men alone on an island that seemed friendly, now. An island they didn't understand. An island that didn't need them. Back on the ships, Columbus was already rewriting events in his mind. To the Catholic monarchs, he would present La Navidad not as a desperate improvisation after a shipwreck, but as a deliberate foundation, a beachhead of Christendom. He would describe the Taíno as generous, innocent, ripe for conversion. He would talk of rivers that gleamed with flecks of gold, of trees that bore strange fruits year-round, of a climate that felt like Eden. He would not, because he could not, describe what would happen next at La Navidad. No European saw it. There were no diaries from inside those walls, no official reports, only rumours and fragments gathered later, after it was already too late. What likely happened? Start with human nature. 39 men, most of them young, armed, and suddenly freed from direct supervision, surrounded by people who seemed, to them, unarmed and vulnerable. A community where hospitality was expected, generosity was a virtue, and social rules were completely different from anything in Castile. Temptation was everywhere. Taíno women, food stores, local gold ornaments. The Spaniards had firearms, steel blades, and a belief, explicitly encouraged by their leaders, that they came from a superior civilization with a divine mandate. Contemporary accounts written after the fact suggest that some of the men at La Navidad quickly ignored Columbus's warnings. They left the fort. They went inland, sometimes in small armed groups, visiting other villages, demanding food, women, and gold. What had begun as a friendly alliance with Guacanagari's people may have eroded under the strain of these abuses. The Taíno, by all evidence, were not passive. They had their own political rivalries, their own regional powers. Other caciques, less impressed by this new alliance with the strangers, may have seen opportunity or danger. Strange men with strange weapons had appeared, making demands, ignoring customs, violating boundaries. In a world where inter-village conflicts already existed, these newcomers might have been treated as just another enemy group, one that could, if necessary, be destroyed. Disease may also have played a role. Even a handful of infected sailors could have brought pathogens no Taíno immune system had ever encountered. Smallpox, measles, influenza, unknown fevers. In later decades, these diseases would devastate entire populations. At La Navidad, they might have killed some of the colonists, or weakened local alliances as sickness spread and suspicions grew. Then there was internal conflict. 39 men, no women, no long-term structure, no clear path to wealth, except what could be taken. Factions could form quickly. Leadership could be challenged. Mutiny or murder among the colonists themselves is not just possible, it's likely. So, picture La Navidad not as a quiet, sleeping outpost, but as a pressure cooker. Frustrations building, promises of gold going unfulfilled, tensions with nearby Taíno slowly rising as news of Spanish behaviour travelled along kinship networks and trade routes. Outsiders testing boundaries, insiders testing each other. By the time Columbus returned, in late 1493, with a full second expedition, 17 ships this time, hundreds of men, horses, seeds, tools, priests, La Navidad was silent. The fort was in ruins, charred wood, scattered belongings, no 39 men stepping out to salute their admiral. No triumphant stories of gold discovered and alliances sealed, just absence. Guacanagari told Columbus that another Taíno leader had attacked the fort, that his own people had been unable to save the Spaniards, that all the colonists were dead. He even showed wounds, scars that may have been real or theatrically emphasized. Was he telling the truth, or a version of it that protected his own position? Were the Spaniards killed in a single decisive attack, or hunted down in small groups as they wandered too far? Did some die of disease before any battle? Did they turn on each other? We don't know. We have Columbus's suspicions coloured by anger and disappointment. We have later Spanish reports trying to make sense of a failure no one wanted to admit. And we have the ground itself. For decades, archaeologists have searched the northern coast of Haiti for La Navidad. They found sites with Spanish artifacts, nails, beads, ceramic fragments, crossbow bolts, early 16th century objects. They've traced shorelines that have shifted, rivers that have changed course, villages that rose and fell. Some evidence points to a likely area, possibly near the modern town of Caracol, but an unequivocal, universally accepted "this is it" moment has remained elusive. Part of the mystery is erosion. Coastlines move, storms tear away evidence, wooden palisades rot. A small, hastily constructed fort standing for less than a year doesn't leave the kind of monumental footprint archaeologists dream of. What does remain is scattered, mingled with Taíno material, blurred by centuries of later activity. So La Navidad lives in a strange space between presence and absence. We know it existed. We know roughly when it was built and when it vanished. We can outline the likely forces at work: greed, misunderstanding, disease, conflict, isolation. But we cannot reconstruct the final days with complete certainty. Was it primarily a Taíno uprising against abuse, an outbreak of disease that left the Spaniards too weak to defend themselves? A collapse from within, ending in a vulnerable, fractured group easily overrun? The best answer is probably some combination of all three. What we can say is this: the first European colony in the Americas did not fall because the environment was too harsh, or because the land was empty and unforgiving. It fell in a place where people were already thriving. It fell in the middle of a living, complex society that reacted in its own ways to the sudden arrival of armed strangers. La Navidad was supposed to be a birth, a beginning. In a sense it was. Its failure shaped everything that followed. When Columbus founded his next settlement, Isabella, he approached it differently. More men, more fortifications, more direct control, far more violence. The lonely little fort built from the bones of the Santa Maria had burned, and with it, one possible path of encounter between two worlds. What rose from its ashes would be something much darker. For now, let the ruined palisade fade in your mind. The charred posts collapsing back into the earth, the last echoes of shouted arguments and distant drums dissolving into the breath of the night sea. The ships are coming back, and this time they're not leaving. The ocean on the way home was not the same ocean they had crossed in September. On the westward journey, the Atlantic had been strangely gentle, almost suspiciously calm. On the way back, it seemed to remember what it was. The winds howled. The waves rose like dark walls. The fragile wooden ships that had carried them into history were suddenly just pieces of timber in a vast, indifferent machine of water and air. Columbus left the Caribbean in January 1493. The Santa Maria was gone, wrecked on the shores of Hispaniola. The men left behind at La Navidad were a gamble he hoped he wouldn't regret. He sailed in the Niña with the damaged Pinta limping alongside. For a while the winds were kind. Then, in February, the Atlantic turned. Picture this: a winter storm rolling off the North Atlantic before satellite forecasts, before barometers, before anyone even knew how big the ocean truly was. The sky thickens. Clouds stack like layers of iron. The wind shifts, rises, twists. The waves grow until the ships are climbing and falling like toys on a restless giant's chest. The fleet is separated. The Pinta vanishes into sheets of rain and foam. On the Niña, sailors pray, vomit, lash themselves to anything solid. The masts groan. The hull creaks as the ocean tries to peel it apart plank by plank. Columbus, who had bet everything, his reputation, his life, his soul, on this voyage, now had to face a simple, brutal truth. If the Atlantic swallowed them here, the discovery would vanish with them. No charts, no maps, no written testimony left behind in Europe, just a few carved crosses on Caribbean shores and some half-remembered stories among the Taíno. So he did something that tells us as much about his mind as his courage. In the middle of a storm that could kill them all, he sat and wrote. He wrote letters, he wrote reports, he wrote lists of islands, descriptions of peoples, promises of gold and souls to be converted. He sealed some of these documents in barrels and threw them into the sea, messages in a bottle designed not for rescue but for legacy. If the Niña sank, maybe the ocean would wash his words ashore in Portugal, in Spain somewhere. Maybe some fisherman would open a salt-stained barrel and find the birth certificate of Europe's new age. He survived. The Niña, battered but intact, made landfall in the Azores, then Portugal, then finally Spain. The Pinta, driven off on its own by the storm, had also survived, arriving separately. The ocean had tried to erase the story. It failed. The story reached shore, and almost immediately that story began to mutate. Columbus's letters moved fast. One of them, addressed to the Spanish monarchs but quickly copied and translated, shot across Europe like an early modern viral post. Printers in Barcelona, then Rome, then Basel and Paris turned it into pamphlets. Within months, people who had never seen the sea were reading about islands where the trees stayed green all year, where the air was soft and warm, where the people went mostly naked and seemed to lack iron, horses, and, crucially, serious weapons. The letter was part observation, part advertisement, part sales pitch. He described the Taíno as generous, open, easy to command. He noted that they had no steel, no cavalry, no apparent organized armies. He talked about gold, always the gold, though he had seen more hints than actual veins. He described the land as fertile, the harbours as excellent, the opportunities as limitless. He called the places he had reached the Indies, still insisting he had found the fringes of Asia. But to the European imagination, something else began to form. A new world. Not new in any real sense. The Americas had been peopled for tens of thousands of years, but new to the maps, new to European greed, new to kings, merchants, and priests who saw in his words a blank page waiting to be written on. By the time Columbus reached Spain in March 1493, his own narrative was already circulating without him. The arrival in Barcelona felt like a stage play he had unknowingly been cast in. Ferdinand and Isabella were not in Seville, or Palos, or wherever a modest sailor might usually report in. They were in Barcelona, presiding over affairs of state, celebrating the completion of the Reconquista, basking in the glow of having driven the last Muslim kingdom from the Iberian Peninsula barely months before Columbus had sailed. So the court moved slowly, ceremonially toward this new marvel. News had prepared them. The storm-surviving admiral had returned with tales of lands beyond the Western Sea. He had not just words, but proof. He brought parrots, with feathers like shards of jungle sunlight. He brought curious woven cotton textiles, strange plants, perhaps a sliver of gold, a few pieces of worked metal. But most powerfully, he brought people. Taíno men, taken from their islands, dressed now in European fabrics, their hair may be trimmed, their ears no longer hearing the soft surf of Caribbean beaches, but the echoing stone of Spanish courtyards and cathedrals. They were presented almost as living trophies, evidence that the stories were true. Look, the message said, here are the inhabitants of the lands beyond the sea. The Indians, proof in human form. In Barcelona they walked at the head of processions. Chroniclers described them as exotic, gentle, bewildered, curiosities among the fur robes and glittering armour of the Spanish nobility. Some were baptized, some were given new names, some tried to communicate in gestures and fragments of words to men who were not really interested in understanding them as equals. The Taíno bodies in that courtyard were treated as signs. signs of royal favour, of divine providence, of opportunity. To many watching, the cruelty was invisible. They saw wonder, not abduction. Columbus knelt at the feet of Ferdinand and Isabella. He described his voyage, his islands, his Indians, his belief that these were the outer skirts of Asia, or at least lands off its eastern shores. He promised more islands, more people to convert, more gold to finance kingdoms and cathedrals. The monarchs listened. They had just finished a centuries-long war. Their armies were idle. Their coffers were not as full as they wished. Their rivals, Portugal above all, were already rich from African gold and Indian Ocean trade routes. Here was a sailor offering a shortcut to the riches of the East, bypassing Portuguese-controlled waters, and he came backed not just by words, but by living evidence. The reception in Barcelona was choreographed to send a message outward as well as inward. To their nobles, Spain, not Portugal, had seized the future. To their neighbours, the Catholic monarchs now claimed rights in lands no other Christian power had seen. To the Church, this was not just commerce, but mission. Millions of souls, Columbus insisted, waited for baptism. Word spread. Merchants in Italian city-states imagined new routes for spices, dyes, timber, sugar. Sailors in port taverns whispered about western islands and easy plunder. Courtiers in France and England listened, envious, wondering how long Spanish secrecy would last. Printers, seeing demand, pushed out more copies of Columbus's letters. The story of 1492 was no longer his alone. It was becoming Europe's. But empires, especially Catholic empires in the late 15th century, did not just expand by rumour and ambition. They needed paperwork. They needed blessings. So Rome was drawn into the story almost immediately. Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, a man whose name still carries the scent of Renaissance intrigue, issued a series of papal bulls in 1493. These bulls, like lines drawn with ink on a globe no one had really mapped yet, granted Spain sweeping rights over lands west of a certain meridian, on the condition that they convert the peoples they encountered. The logic was simple, if deeply distorted. All non-Christian lands were, in theory, available to whichever Christian monarch discovered and claimed them, as long as they brought the church along. The bulls tried to settle a growing tension. Portugal had long-standing papal support for its African and Eastern ventures. Spain now demanded recognition of its Western ones. Imaginary lines, but with very real consequences. The Portuguese were not satisfied. They negotiated. The result, in 1494, was the Treaty of Tordesillas. Representatives of Spain and Portugal sat down and, with maps that were mostly guesswork, divided the non-European world between them. A line was drawn, roughly 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. Lands to the west would fall under Spanish influence. Lands to the east would belong to Portugal. They were slicing up continents they had barely glimpsed. They did not know a vast continent lay between the Caribbean and Asia. They did not know that the line they drew would one day place a large slice of South America, what would become Brazil, inside the Portuguese half by accident of geometry. They did not understand the human complexity of the worlds they were claiming. Thousands of nations, hundreds of languages, cultures as intricate as anything in Europe. From their perspective, however, this was order. This was legality. This was God's approval stamped over ambition. The bulls and the treaty wrapped conquest in a cloak of righteousness. To the Taíno, to the Maya, to the Mexica and Inca and countless others, none of this paperwork mattered. But it would shape the armies, ships and governors that were now preparing to cross the ocean in escalating numbers. Back in Spain, as scribes copied treaties and bulls, another kind of preparation was underway. Columbus's next voyage would not be 3 small ships, nervously crossing an unknown sea. It would be a fleet, 17 vessels, over 1,000 men, horses, pigs, cattle, tools, seeds, priests with baptismal fonts and crosses, soldiers with steel swords and gunpowder, craftsmen, colonists, and more chains. This time, the goal was not just exploration, it was colonization. The instructions he received from the monarchs were clear: establish permanent settlements, find and secure sources of gold, convert the natives, enforce Spanish authority. The romantic uncertainty of the first voyage, the sense of stepping into the truly unknown, was being replaced by a colder, more systematic logic. Ports would be built, lands would be granted, labour would be demanded, resistance, if it came, would be crushed. Some of the men who signed up for the second voyage had read the embellished accounts of the first. They imagined easy plunder, docile peoples, tropical abundance. Others came seeking status, land, or escape from their lives in Europe. Almost none of them understood that they were boarding ships, not just for a journey west, but for the beginning of a centuries-long transformation that would reorder continents, destroy civilizations, and create new ones in their place. In the harbours of Cadiz, as the second fleet assembled in late 1493, the air would have been thick with the smell of tar and freshly cut timber, the clatter of barrels being rolled up planks, the shouts of officers corralling men and animals. Above it all, invisible but present, hovered the words of those papal bulls and those royal orders. A world they didn't understand had been divided, claimed, and now in their minds awaited occupation. Columbus stood on the deck again, the hero of Barcelona, the bearer of letters and living proof. But beneath the glory and the incense and the promises, something darker had already begun. The seeds of tragedy were sown not just in greed or in steel, but in the simple, catastrophic belief that a place only truly entered history when Europe wrote its name on it. The fleet would soon sail. Back where this had all begun, on the island of Hispaniola, 39 men at La Navidad waited in a world that had changed around them while Europe drew lines on maps. Close your eyes and imagine the ocean again. On the surface, in 1493, it looks calm. Just wooden ships creaking in the waves, sails billowing, men half asleep on deck. But inside those ships, something else is moving, invisible, microscopic, silent. Seeds packed in barrels, animals penned below decks, and in the blood and lungs and skin of the sailors themselves, viruses. When Columbus crossed the Atlantic, he didn't just move people and flags and rumours of gold. He accidentally stitched together two biological worlds that had been separated for tens of thousands of years. Ecologists call what followed the Columbian Exchange not a treaty, not a trade deal, but a planetary remix of plants, animals, and diseases so massive that some historians argue it's the single most important ecological event since the end of the last ice age. For more than 10,000 years, the Americas had developed on their own biological track. Europe, Africa, and Asia, what historians often group as the Old World, had their own track. Different crops, different animals, different germs. When the first Spanish ships crossed the Atlantic, those tracks slammed together. It didn't happen all at once. There was no moment when someone announced, "Welcome to the Columbian Exchange." But over the next few decades, every voyage, every barrel, every cage, every breath of a coffin sailor carried pieces of one world into the other. Some of those pieces were deadly. Start with disease. In Europe, children grew up in a world crowded with domesticated animals, cows, pigs, chickens, goats, with cities where sewage, garbage, and humans all shared the same cramped space. In that environment, diseases had been evolving, mutating, and burning through populations for thousands of years. Smallpox, measles, influenza, whooping cough, typhus. Old World people carried the scars of this history in their bodies. Not immunity in the absolute sense, but partial resistance built up over generations. Those who had no resistance had often died young. Those who survived passed on genes and immune systems that could deal, at least somewhat, with these microscopic killers. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had faced their own illnesses, but not these. They had no long history of living cheek by jowl with Eurasian herd animals. No centuries of devastating plagues caused by those animals' viruses jumping into humans. When smallpox and measles arrived, for many communities, it was like encountering alien life. We don't have precise numbers, we probably never will. But most historians and demographers think the population collapse in the Americas after 1492 was one of the greatest demographic catastrophes in human history. In some regions, estimates suggest that within a century 70, 80, even 90% of the indigenous population may have died. Not all at once. Waves. A ship arrives. Someone coughs. A few weeks later, people are sick in a coastal village. Then the disease travels faster than Europeans can walk, crossing trade routes, moving from town to town, carried by people who have never seen a European face. Imagine being there. 1 year, your world is intact. Your gods, your festivals, your planting cycles, your neighbours. Then, within a few seasons, elders are gone. Children are gone. Leaders, farmers, artisans, healers, gone. The social systems that hold everything together start to fray, not because of battles with steel and gunpowder, but because invisible particles are rewriting the math of survival. The Spanish did bring violence. They brought conquest, slavery, forced labour. But in many places disease got there first, and did most of the killing before anyone in armour ever appeared on the horizon. Yet the exchange wasn't just one-sided. It wasn't only death moving west. Sometimes life and abundance flowed east. Think about your dinner plate. Tomatoes, potatoes, corn, chocolate, peanuts, chili peppers. All of these are American species. For tens of thousands of years, not a single Italian, Chinese, Indian, or West African farmer had ever seen a tomato plant, a potato tuber, a cacao pod, or an ear of maize. Within a few centuries of 1492, they were everywhere. Take the potato. A humble Andean tuber, adapted to high altitudes and cold nights, with an almost ridiculous amount of calories crammed into a small package. When Europeans finally began planting potatoes seriously, especially in places like Ireland, the effect was explosive. Suddenly you could feed more people on the same amount of land. Populations grew. Villages that once scraped by on grain harvests now had a backup. This little underground food from the Andes quietly helped fuel Europe's population boom. Tomatoes travelled a different path. At first, Europeans were suspicious. Some thought they were poisonous. They were, after all, part of the nightshade family. But gradually, cooks in places like Spain and Italy started experimenting. Sauces changed. Flavours deepened. The classic Italian cuisine people romanticize today, tomato sauces, pizza, rich red pastas, would have been literally impossible before the Columbian Exchange. No tomatoes, no marinara. Maize, corn, may have been the biggest global game-changer of all. Developed by indigenous farmers in Mesoamerica from a wild grass called teosinte, maize was a human creation, shaped over generations of careful selection. After 1492, it spread across Europe, Africa, and Asia, becoming a staple food in regions that had never known it existed. In parts of Africa and the Balkans, people built entire diets around cornmeal. In China, maize helps sustain farmers in marginal upland soils, extending cultivation into places that rice couldn't easily reach. And then there was chocolate. Cacao, once a sacred drink among Mesoamerican elites, crossed the ocean and slowly evolved into the sweetened, milky form that would become a global obsession. What began as a bitter, spiced ritual beverage ended up as a comfort food in European drawing rooms and eventually in vending machines. So while disease was tearing societies apart in the Americas, American crops were beginning to reshape diets and populations in the Old World. More calories, more people, new cuisines, new comforts. It was a deeply uneven trade, but it was a trade. The flow in the other direction wasn't just germs, it was hooves and snouts and roots and weeds. When Columbus returned to the Caribbean on his second voyage, he didn't come with just men. He came with animals that had never set foot in the Americas: horses, cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and seeds of European crops: wheat, barley, olives, sugar cane, on islands where there had once been only native mammals like hutias and bats. Pigs were suddenly rooting through the undergrowth, eating anything they could find. They multiplied quickly, often escaping into the wild, turning into feral herds that disrupted indigenous gardens and trampled native plants. Horses were even more transformative. There had been horses in the Americas long ago, but they'd gone extinct at the end of the last ice age. When the Spanish reintroduced them, they didn't just alter transportation, they rewired entire cultures. Over time, indigenous peoples in the Great Plains of North America, far from the Caribbean, would adopt horses and create new ways of living built around mounted hunting and mobility. But in the early years after Columbus, the change was just beginning. A few animals here and there, some fear, some fascination, and a future no one yet imagined. European plants behaved like quiet invaders. Wheat and barley needed cleared land, so forests were cut, fields were ploughed. Sometimes European weeds came along for the ride, plants that stowed away in bags of grain or clung to the hooves of animals, then spread across new landscapes, outcompeting native species. Sugar cane, carried from the Old World tropics, would become one of the most important and brutal crops in the New World. It grew well in the Caribbean climate, too well. European demand for sugar soared, plantations expanded, and with them came another terrible part of the exchange: the forced transport of millions of enslaved Africans to labour in fields that hadn't existed before 1492. A human current crossing the Atlantic in chains, driven by a plant that had changed continents. Even disease may not have been a purely one-way street. For centuries, doctors and historians have debated the origins of syphilis. Some argue it existed in the Old World before 1492, but was misdiagnosed as other diseases. Others point to evidence suggesting it first appeared in Europe shortly after Columbus's voyages, spreading rapidly through armies and brothels, its symptoms far more severe than the later, more familiar form. In that telling, syphilis is the American disease that went the other way across the Atlantic, a grim reminder that the Columbian exchange wasn't a simple story of Europeans giving and indigenous peoples receiving. It was a genuine exchange, even if the balance of suffering was heavily weighted. Over the long term, the Columbian exchange reshaped global agriculture so thoroughly that it's hard to imagine the world before it. India without chili peppers, West Africa without cassava or maize, Ireland without potatoes, Italy without tomatoes, Switzerland without chocolate, the American Midwest without wheat, the Caribbean without sugarcane, the Great Plains without horses, all of that impossible, all of that unthinkable. Tonight, if you open your kitchen cupboards, you're looking at the aftershocks of 1492. Coffee from one region, sugar from another, spices from another, chocolate, tomatoes, peppers, potatoes. A tiny museum of the Columbian exchange, displayed as groceries, and it's still going. We're still moving species around the planet, sometimes deliberately, sometimes by accident. Still creating new ecological combinations with consequences we don't fully understand. But in 1492, when Columbus first stepped onto that Caribbean beach, none of the people there, Spanish or Taíno, could see any of this. To them, It was just contact between two human societies. They didn't know that plants were already planning their invasions, that animals were waiting in ships' holds to redraw maps of possibility, that viruses were quietly calculating their next host. The armies of conquest were not just men with swords and guns. They were microbes, seeds, and hooves. Biology had entered the story, and it was about to rewrite it. Picture the ocean again, but not the lonely, anxious sea of the first voyage. This time it's crowded. 17 ships, hundreds of men, horses, attack dogs, seeds and tools, chains. Columbus isn't just an explorer now. On paper, he's a viceroy, an admiral of a new world. This second voyage, which leaves Spain in September 1493, isn't about finding out what's there. It's about deciding what to do with it. Spain knows much more this time. The court has heard Columbus's stories of gentle people, gold ornaments, and endless fertile islands. The dream has hardened into a plan. Colonies, plantations, mines. The monarchy wants returns on its investment, fast. So the fleet that sails west is less like a scientific expedition and more like a moving city of conquest. There are priests to convert souls, hidalgos to claim land and status, bureaucrats to record who owns what, soldiers to make sure everyone gets in line. Some of the men on board probably imagine a tropical Eden, warm water, easy riches, friendly people ready to help. Others, more experienced with war in Spain's recent campaigns against Muslim Granada, may already be thinking about forts, tribute, and how to keep restless men under control on lands no European has ever ruled. They're not going back to nothing. They're going back to La Navidad. Columbus had left about 40 men there on the north coast of Hispaniola after the wreck of the Santa Maria. A tiny outpost made from the cannibalized timbers of a ship, stocked with promises, gold to be found inland, alliances to build with local chiefs, a peaceful foothold in a new world. Now, as the fleet approaches Hispaniola almost a year later, Columbus must be wondering what he'll see. Smoke from cooking fires, men running down to the shore, cheering, a thriving little community trading with nearby Taíno villages. Instead, they find ruins. La Navidad is gone. The buildings are burned, the fort destroyed, the men dead. Some accounts say their bodies were visible, scattered and decomposed. Others suggest the remains had already been taken care of, the site abandoned to vines and silence. Taíno sources and later Spanish testimonies give a simple explanation. The men Columbus left had not behaved like guests. They fought among themselves, abused local women, demanded too much food, searched obsessively for gold, and tried to bully chiefs who didn't see any reason to obey them. One local leader, Taíno, is often named as the one who finally decided, enough. His warriors overran the settlement and killed the garrison. To the Taíno, this might have been a local correction, a response to a violent, troublesome group. To Columbus and his men arriving with 17 ships, it looks like something very different. It looks like rebellion, and rebellion calls for punishment. Any trace of hesitation that may have lingered after the first voyage dissolves almost instantly. The tone shifts from curiosity to control. The search for gold becomes entangled with the desire for revenge. The vision of a peaceful trading colony hardens into a plan for domination. Within days, Columbus orders a new settlement not far from the ruins of La Navidad. This one is called La Isabela, in honor of the Queen. But the pattern written into its foundations is less a tribute, and more a warning. Walls, storehouses, a church, a gallows. From the beginning, the relationship with the Taíno is framed in terms of tribute. Columbus needs proof for Spain. Gold, cotton, labour. He also needs to keep his own men from turning on him. Many had been promised wealth. Few find any. Hunger, disease, and disappointment set in quickly. So Columbus reaches for a system that will become one of the defining features of early Spanish rule in the Americas, the encomienda. On paper, the encomienda is almost benign. Spanish colonists are entrusted with groups of indigenous people. In return for protecting them, teaching them Christianity, and supposedly looking after their welfare, the colonists can demand labour, tribute, and service. In reality, it's something much simpler. It's organised exploitation dressed in legal language. Taíno communities who had once farmed, fished, and hunted for their own needs now find themselves obligated to carry food, build roads, work in mines, and serve in Spanish households. Men are forced to pan rivers for flecks of gold. Women grind grain, haul water, and serve the colonists in more intimate, coercive ways. Children run errands until they collapse from exhaustion. Some areas are ordered to deliver a specific quota of gold every few months. Those who meet the quota receive a small token, like a copper or brass disc to wear around the neck, marking them as compliant. Those who don't, or who try to avoid the mines, face brutal punishment. There are accounts, reported by later critics like Bartolomé de las Casas, of hands being cut off, of bodies maimed as warnings, of villages burned for failing to produce enough. Even if every individual story can't be verified, the overall pattern is clear. A system built to extract maximum labour from a population that had no immunity to European diseases, no experience with this kind of coerced work, and no escape route off their own islands. Columbus, now acting as governor, proves far better at imagining grand titles than managing people. He has to juggle contradictory pressures. The Spanish crown wants profits and order. The colonists want land, labour and personal freedom. The Taíno want their autonomy and safety. Instead of balancing these, Columbus often satisfies the most aggressive voices in his own camp, while lashing out at indigenous resistance. Food shortages hit early. La Isabela is badly sighted. Poor soil, brackish water, scurvy, dysentery and infection spread through the Spanish population. Some colonists mutter that Columbus misled them. Others openly defy his orders, raiding Taíno villages for food and women. To reassert control, Columbus authorizes a campaign of terror against those he sees as threats, especially Carnival, the chief associated with the destruction of La Navidad. Through deception and force, Spanish forces capture him. He is bound in chains, paraded as a trophy, and eventually dies on a ship bound for Spain. But if Columbus thinks cutting off the head of resistance will end it, he's mistaken. Across Hispaniola and neighbouring islands, Taíno leaders notice a pattern. The strangers' demands only increase. Their violence escalates. Their numbers grow with every ship. Chiefs who had initially tried to host and appease now begin to plot something else: resistance. In 1495, a major coalition of Taíno warriors confront Spanish forces in the interior of Hispaniola. Estimates of their numbers vary wildly, tens of thousands in some reports, perhaps far fewer in reality. But the sense is the same. This is not a minor skirmish. It's an attempt to push the invaders back. It fails. Steel weapons, crossbows, cavalry and war dogs give the Spanish a decisive advantage. Horses in particular terrify fighters who have never seen such animals before. After the battle, Columbus's forces pursue fleeing groups, capturing many as slaves. Some are kept to work the fields and mines. Others are shipped to Spain and sold. This is one of the earliest waves of mass indigenous enslavement in the Americas under Spanish rule. It won't be the last. The devastation isn't just from war and forced labour. Diseases, likely smallpox, influenza and other Eurasian infections, begin to move quietly through Taíno communities. People who have never encountered these pathogens have no built-up immunity. Deaths rise, often without the Spanish fully understanding why. To the Taíno, it may seem as if the arrival of the strangers has called down a new kind of invisible curse. Some historians hesitate to use the word genocide for this early period, pointing out that the Spanish crown occasionally passed laws meant to limit abuses. But on the ground, the combination of deliberate terror, mass enslavement, systematic overwork, and indifference to Taíno survival feels very much like a slow-motion extermination. Reports start flowing back across the Atlantic. Not just triumphant tales of conquest, but disturbing accounts of chaos. Colonists write letters complaining that Columbus and his brothers are tyrannical, favouring their own friends, hoarding privileges, punishing dissenters. Others accuse him of weakness, of not being harsh enough, not delivering enough gold, not keeping the colony orderly. The crown is far away, but not deaf. Spain has just invested enormous prestige in this venture, and it can't afford complete collapse. So, in the late 1490s, royal officials begin to take a closer interest in what is actually happening in Hispaniola. In 1500, a royal commissioner, Francisco de Bobadilla, arrives with broad powers. He hears the complaints, sees the prisons filled with both Spaniards and Taíno, and reads the accounts of whippings, hangings, and mutilations. Whatever personal motives he might have, he comes to a clear conclusion. The colony is out of control, and Columbus is at the centre of the storm. Bobadilla arrests Columbus and his brothers. The admiral who once stood before the Spanish court as the discoverer of a new world is now placed in irons, not symbolically, not as a gesture, but with real chains on his wrists and ankles, loaded onto a ship bound back across the same ocean he had crossed in triumph only a few years earlier. Sailing east this time, Columbus reportedly refuses to have the chains removed, even when offered. Some later stories claim he keeps them until the end of his life, a physical reminder of how quickly fortune can reverse. By the time he reaches Spain again, the myth has already started to split away from the man. To many in Europe, he is still the visionary who found a western route to lands unknown. To those who lived under his rule in the Caribbean, he is something else entirely. An incompetent governor, a brutal master, a man whose arrival turned their world from a complex, thriving island society into a landscape of hunger, fear, and loss. Between 1493 and 1500, the paradise that Columbus had described on his first voyage is already slipping away. Forests are being cleared, villages disrupted or destroyed, populations forced into new patterns of labour and dependence. A door that had been opened with gifts and curiosity is now held wide with swords and shackles. The age of exploration has already become the age of conquest. And for the Taíno, the clock is ticking. By the time Columbus reached the end of his life, the world he thought he discovered still existed only in his imagination. Picture him in 1506, an aging man in Valladolid, Spain. His joints aching from decades at sea, his eyesight failing, his reputation already dimmer than it had been on that triumphant day in Barcelona, when he first returned with captives and gold trinkets. He's been arrested once, shipped back to Spain in chains after accusations of cruelty and misrule in the Caribbean. He has fought legal battles to regain the titles he was promised, the share of wealth he believed was his by right. The Admiral of the Ocean Sea now spends much of his time writing letters and petitions, arguing, pleading, insisting that he has been wronged. But through all of this, one belief never wavers. He is certain he reached Asia. To his dying day, Columbus insists that the lands he sailed to are the outskirts of the Indies, the fringes of Cathay and Cipangu, Asia's eastern shores. He pores over maps and biblical prophecies. He tries to reconcile what he saw with what he expected to see. The people, the plants, the distances. None of it quite fits Marco Polo's descriptions, but he rationalizes, adjusts, reinterprets. He never accepts that he found a continent that Europe didn't know existed. So Columbus dies as he lived, half navigator, half visionary, locked inside a mental map that the real world is already starting to erase. And for a while, history almost erases him too. In the decades after his death, other names rise. Amerigo Vespucci, whose letters describe a new world distinct from Asia, Hernan Cortés, Francisco Pizarro, men whose ruthless conquests shower Spain with silver and gold on a scale Columbus never imagined. Cartographers start writing America on their maps. Lisbon and Seville buzz with new routes, new schemes, new empires. Columbus becomes just one among many explorers, a starting point, not a legend. The transformation from fallible navigator to near-mythic hero comes much later, under very different skies. Fast forward to the 18th and 19th centuries. A new country has appeared on those maps, the United States. It has broken away from Britain and is searching for a story, a founding myth that doesn't depend on kings or ancient European traditions. Columbus is perfect. He didn't sail for England. He represents daring, risk, crossing an ocean. He can be reshaped into a symbol of discovery, of bold beginnings, of what people call the spirit of the New World. So American writers and politicians start to reinvent him. Schoolbooks turn a complicated Genoese mariner into a flawless visionary who proved the world was round, even though educated Europeans already knew that. Paintings show him stepping majestically onto pristine shores, flag in hand, as if history itself were waiting just for him. Poems and parades celebrate his courage. Cities, rivers, and a new federal district take his name: Columbia, Columbus, the District of Columbia. The messy details fade. The arrests, the mismanagement, the violence, those are brushed aside or not mentioned at all. The Taíno and other indigenous peoples disappear from the story, replaced by vague Indians in the background of heroic scenes. The real man, who died uncertain, is turned into a statue, literally. Marble Columbus towers over public squares, always pointing west, always on the brink of a discovery that no longer quite matches what actually happened. But the people who were on those islands when he arrived, they never had the luxury of forgetting. For indigenous communities across the Americas, 1492 isn't just a date on a timeline. It's the beginning of a long, painful before and after, in Taíno oral traditions, in Caribbean folk memory, in the stories passed down quietly within families. Columbus is not a heroic stranger. He's the doorway through which disease, slavery, and displacement came. Yet even in the face of devastation, their story doesn't end. Taíno identity for a long time was said to have vanished. Many historians once wrote that they were completely wiped out within a few generations, but genetic studies, linguistic traces, family names, and living cultural practices in Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Jamaica, and beyond tell a more complex story. People across the Caribbean today recognize Taíno roots in their food, their music, their agricultural techniques, their words: hurricane, canoe, barbecue, hammock. Community groups and activists explicitly reclaim Taíno heritage, not as a romantic fantasy, but as a quiet insistence. We are still here. Our ancestors did not vanish. They survived in us. Across the Americas, indigenous perspectives on Columbus are different in tone but united in one basic truth. For them, 1492 marks not discovery, but invasion. In the Haudenosaunee territories around the Great Lakes, in Andean communities in Peru and Bolivia, among the Maya in Mexico and Guatemala, Columbus is often seen as the first in a line of outsiders who brought forced conversions, land seizures, and epidemics. Yet the story they tell is not just one of loss, it's also survival. Languages preserved against all odds, ceremonies conducted in secret when they were outlawed, knowledge of planting cycles, medicinal plants, and sacred landscapes passed on quietly, parent to child, generation after generation beneath the noise of empire. In the 20th and 21st centuries, those quiet survivals become louder. Protests begin to challenge the parades and statues, Indigenous scholars and writers publish accounts that center their own ancestors' experiences rather than European viewpoints. The mythic, one-sided Columbus story starts to fracture, revealing the people who were always there but rarely acknowledged. This is where the modern Columbus Day controversy comes from. For many Italian Americans in the United States, Columbus Day began as a way to claim respect in a country that discriminated against them. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, Italian immigrants faced violent stereotypes and suspicion. Honoring an Italian navigator who helped open the Americas became a symbol of pride and belonging. So for some, Columbus Day is still tied up with that history of struggle and acceptance. For many indigenous people, though, the same holiday feels like a celebration of the day their world started to collapse. It feels like a public festival held at the site of a family tragedy. These two emotional truths clash. That's why, around the early 1990s and into the 2000s, you start to see a shift. Cities, states, and countries begin replacing or pairing Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day, Dia de la Resistencia Indígena, or similar observances. The focus moves from honoring a single European explorer to recognizing the survival and contributions of native peoples. Different places remember 1492 in very different ways. In Spain, October 12th is celebrated as the Fiesta Nacional, also called Dia de la Hispanidad. It emphasizes the creation of a Spanish-speaking world, the spread of language and culture across continents. Official narratives often highlight exploration and global influence more than conquest. In much of Latin America, the same date has worn many names: Dia de la Raza, Dia de la Hispanidad, Dia de la Resistencia Indígena, Dia del Encuentro de dos Mundos. Each name reflects a different interpretation: mixture, domination, encounter, resistance. In the Caribbean, the memory is especially intertwined with the Taíno story and with the transatlantic slave trade that followed. 1492, there is the first beat in a rhythm that soon includes enslaved Africans, forced labour, sugar plantations, and revolutions. And in many classrooms around the world today, 1492 is presented not as a neat turning point, but as a tangled knot in global history. Economic historians see it as the start of massive wealth transfers, the rise of Atlantic empires. Environmental historians see it as a key moment in the reshaping of ecosystems. Indigenous historians see a catastrophe and a beginning. While we argue about statues and holidays, archaeologists quietly keep digging. On islands Columbus visited, underwater teams explore shipwrecks from his later voyages, piecing together details of how those expeditions were supplied and how they failed. On Hispaniola and Cuba, researchers excavate Taíno villages, revealing complex societies with ball courts, ceremonial plazas, and sophisticated agriculture that Columbus barely understood. Chemical analysis of human remains shows changing diets as European crops and animals appear. Isotope studies track movement, showing who was local, who was forced to move, who married into whom. DNA evidence hints at early mixing between Spanish, Taíno, and African populations sooner than many written records suggest. Every few years, a new find shifts the picture slightly. A Taíno village turns out to have been larger than assumed. A European artifact appears in a layer earlier than expected. A re-evaluation of Columbus's own logbooks suggests he may have misjudged distances more drastically than once believed. History keeps rewriting itself, not because the past changes, but because our questions do. And this is where the story of 1492 becomes something more than a debate about one man. When you pull back and look at all the layers, Columbus's stubborn belief that he reached Asia, the American reinvention of him as a flawless hero, the indigenous memories of catastrophe and survival, the modern controversies over holidays and statues, the ongoing archaeological discoveries, you start to see that there isn't one single way to remember that year. There are many. Each perspective is like a different shoreline glimpsed from the deck of a ship at night. You see part of it, lit by whatever lantern you happen to be holding. The rest disappears into darkness, not because it isn't there, but because your light just doesn't reach it yet. Understanding this doesn't make history simpler, it makes it richer. Columbus can be both a skilled navigator and a deeply flawed leader. 1492 can be both a beginning of global connections and the start of immense suffering. The Taíno can be both victims of disease and violence and ancestors of living communities who refuse to vanish. When we let all these truths exist side by side, history stops being a flat painting of a man planting a flag. It becomes something closer to real life, messy, painful, astonishing, full of unintended consequences and quiet acts of endurance. And as you drift towards sleep, you might imagine those first nights after October 12th, 1492. The Taíno on their islands, telling stories about the strange ships and their pale-skinned visitors. Columbus on his flagship, writing in his journal by lantern light, convinced he is on the edge of Asia. All of them unaware that centuries later, people they could never imagine would still be arguing, digging, remembering, and reimagining what those days meant. The waves that rocked their ships and lapped at their shores are long gone, but the ripples from that moment, they're still moving, quietly, through our maps, our languages, our holidays, and our dreams. So now, as the waves calm and the sails slacken, you're lying there somewhere between waking and sleep, with 1492 still echoing softly in your mind. A single voyage, 3 small ships, a few hundred men, and yet everything that followed, the empires, the epidemics, the plantations, the revolutions, even the languages many of us are thinking in right now, unfolded from that collision of worlds. On one side of the ocean, a Europe hungry for spices, land, and salvation. On the other, the Taíno and countless other peoples living in worlds that were complete and coherent long before Columbus ever saw a shoreline in the dark. 2 realities, both fully human, meeting in a moment neither side could truly understand. When we look back, it's easy to see only forces. The age of exploration, the rise of Europe, the fall of indigenous America. Big phrases that sound like they move on rails, but underneath all of that were real people who woke up each morning not knowing they were history. A Taíno child watching strange floating mountains appear on the horizon. A Spanish sailor gripping a rosary in the night, seasick and terrified the maps were wrong. A cacique deciding whether to offer hospitality or caution to these newcomers. A translator caught between 2 languages, trying to make sense of words neither side really had yet. Words for ownership, for God, for land, for forever. History isn't just dates and titles, it's pulses and breaths, fears and hopes, all layered on top of each other. It's the quiet sound of waves against a hull, the night before a landing that will change the world, and the rustle of palm leaves in a village that has no idea it's about to be renamed, redrawn, and rewritten. As you drift towards sleep, you might let your mind wander back over the scenes we've visited. The crowded, anxious streets of late medieval Spain, the open ocean at night, stars wheeling overhead as the crew whispers about turning back. The first moments on that Caribbean beach, where nobody yet knows who is discovering whom. The slow realization, over months and years, that this isn't a brief encounter, but the beginning of something that cannot be undone. One voyage, and yet centuries of consequences. The crops that changed diets on both sides of the ocean. The diseases that tore through communities. The ideas that spread, twisted, resisted. The memories that were preserved and the stories that were silenced. All of it somehow connected back to those first footprints in the sand in October 1492. You don't have to decide right now in the dark whether Columbus was hero, villain, or something in between. You don't have to solve the debate before you fall asleep. You can simply hold the complexity for a moment. A world before contact, a world after, and that narrow, fragile bridge between them, walked by men who didn't know they were crossing from one era of human history into another. As your breathing slows, you might reflect on how many turning points there have been. How often a single choice, a ship launched, a voyage funded, a shoreline approached, ripples outward through centuries until it leaves faint traces even in your life, in your language, in the foods you eat, in the maps you learned as a child. One night in 1492 shaping countless nights after. If you're still awake and you've enjoyed drifting through this piece of the past, you can gently tap like or subscribe so you can fall asleep with more stories like this whenever you need them. If you feel like sharing, you can leave a quiet comment telling us where in the world you're listening from. Curled up in a small apartment in Madrid maybe, or in a dorm room in Sao Paulo, or on a couch somewhere far from the Atlantic letting old oceans rock you to sleep. If you'd like to support this channel a little more, you can also join our YouTube membership. It's completely optional, only if it feels right for you, and simply another way to help us keep making long, calm journeys through history, night after night. But for now, you don't need to do anything at all. You can let the story fade into the background, like a ship disappearing over the horizon. Let the last traces of 1492 blur at the edges, the voices growing softer, the lantern light on the deck dimming to black. The waves that once carried Columbus across the ocean can carry you somewhere gentler now. Let them rock you. Let the distant surf of centuries roll in and out. The islands grow quiet. The ships anchor for the night. The stars above the Caribbean sky hold their silent watch, and you can drift off with history.